Hi everyone, and welcome to the talk series arranged by UCL, MoCDA, and Hobs3D in collaboration around this project related to abstract art in new media work. So we're having Marie Chatel, our curator in MoCDA today, welcoming our artists and science speakers today. Hello, Marie, and welcome everybody.
Hello, Serena.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I just wanted to briefly introduce this project, which was made in collaboration with Cognitive Science Department of UCL. We opened a show about a month ago at MoCDA, which includes the artist's work that we're having today in this talk panel. And I also wanted to say that you're most welcome to share your comments and questions throughout this chat, and we'll welcome them and pick them up as we go through this live talk. So I'll let Marie introduce our speakers for today.
Hello, so today we'll be talking about creating abstract works in the age of in the digital age. And with me today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Banz Bowinkel, a German artist duo who uses virtual reality, moving images, and snapshots to explore the relationship between virtual and real spaces. Hi, Julia. Hi, Friedman.
Hello.
Hi.
We also have with us Chris Dorland, a New York-based artist whose practice lies at the intersection of painting and new media. He uses a lot of digital and analog tools to develop narratives around abstract and representation. So welcome, Chris.
Good to be here.
We also have Sara Ludy, an American multidisciplinary artist working with both physical and digital media. She explores dreams, consciousness, and immateriality in her work. Last artist on the panel, we have also David Young. He's exploring the creative potential of emerging technologies, and his work now explores beauty and aesthetics through the lens of artificial intelligence. Welcome, David. Welcome, Sarah. Along with us, we also have Chris McManus, who is a professor of psychology at the University College London. He's got a long-standing interest in art and is an early researcher of neuroaesthetics. He's done numerous studies of Mondrian photography, the cropping of images in the sublime, which he'll be talking to us, which he'll be telling us about shortly. Hi, Chris. Sorry, the introduction kind of made me nervous. To start this panel, I would like for you to kind of introduce yourself and your work. We've prepared some slides, and I think this will allow you to kind of explain which media you're working with and why. And so let's start with Banz Bowinkel.
Yeah, hi. We're working together since about 10 years now, and almost as long we do digital art. We have started with 3D renderings images, but have also gone into virtual reality and virtual reality installations, which you can see here in an installation of a piece called Palo Alto. We're mainly interested in how the computer affects our, our perspective on reality and on us and on our environment in general. And we are really, dazzled by the corridor that the computer opens to human mankind. We think it's close to the invention of script, basically, and it's really interesting to to observe how this tool, the computer, by the way it is structured, structures our nowadays societies. You can see that when you watch, for example, social networks. Basically, the computer has taken over our complete environment, and simply everything we do today is run by computers. And the structure of these computers defines the way we interact, the way we live, the way we perceive, the way we think. And so for us, it's really interesting to explore these rules that the computer, first of all, we give the computer the rules, but then the computer applies these rules back to us. And this is a very interesting loop that we are in today. And so mainly our work is based on this loop.
Great. Well, that is great. Let's perhaps move to Sara. Sara, could you please introduce your?
So I work with a lot of different mediums, and I'm kind of interested in this hybrid space. Let's see. Yeah, I'm interested in the nature of immateriality and consciousness. I think a lot about just like what it means to be alive on a planet. And I think a lot about like consciousness as a material. So my work is kind of, about like my knowledge and experience of those things. And I guess like for this talk in particular, since, I have these digital paintings in this exhibition, I think, for me, like I see myself as a painter. I always have, even though I work with these digital technologies. I kind of like accessing this space where, like things aren't necessarily intellectualized, and I can just kind of like be in the moment. I mean, it's hard to like kind of wrap my practice up in such a short time. But yeah, it's kind of rooted in like consciousness, immateriality. I love physics too. So those are just kind of things that I read about all the time. I mean, I see a connection to digital media and consciousness. So yeah.
Great. Well, we'll have the opportunity to delve further into this during the talk. Chris Dorland, could you please introduce your work?
Hi, my name is Chris Dorland. I'm a New York-based artist. I have been working kind of at the intersection of painting and new media for about maybe a decade. I started really originally as a painter, but always interested in reproduction and sort of reproductive techniques. And as that kind of developed, I got more interested. So first it started with like traditional oil painting, but my interest sort of pushed me farther into, oversized Xeroxes and different techniques to duplicate reproduction. And at some point, and media. And at some point that developed into an interest in video. And I think that's when the kind of merger really fully happened. And the painting sort of left, wanting to work in oil paint and really developing different surfaces and different ways of producing an image on canvas. And I've worked in a variety of different medium. What we're looking at now are all paintings from a show that I have up right now at Lyles and King in New York. The show is called New Day, and it's 2 video works and then a series of large-scale linen paintings. And it's the first time I'm showing this body of work. So on the left side, you can see kind of like a detail, and then the painting on the right side. You can skip to the next slide, maybe. And so you can't really tell because the screen, I guess, is small, but they're really kind of compressed. And these are the two. This is one of the video works. And the video for the show, the video work is getting more and more data based. So I worked with a developer to program this octopus. It's too bad I couldn't get any footage of it moving, but it's a sort of strange hybrid creature that is kind of reflecting data back through its tentacles as it moves around. And there's actually elements of the paintings that get reflected back into the octopus's body as it moves. So I feel like it's a kind of, I mean, both, it sounds like Sara is in the same place where, you know, how does painting and new media and technology, how do those things interact? And that's, I guess, what's at the crux of my work and my interests as an artist. You know, a very old-fashioned media like painting, and then sort of the newer technologies. And actually, I think they have a lot in common.
Great, thank you for this. David, would you please introduce your work as well?
Sure. So I'm David Young. I am also normally based in New York City, although since the pandemic have relocated to a place in rural upstate New York. And currently I'm with my husband, we're snowbirds, and so we're driving around the South. And I'm in this quite gothic, crumbling place in New Orleans, which is pretty cool. And I'll also add that I tried to learn how to surf 2 days ago and ended up getting stung by a jellyfish and broke my toe. So I'm a little bit of a mess. My work has always been around new and emerging technology and media. You know, I started with working with AI in the 80s when there was a sort of a first boom around the technology, and you know, have successfully moved through other kinds of new technologies, whether it's, you know, the web or mobile. And had always been a kind of a technical optimist, thinking that, you know, with these new tools, they enable such new ways for people to express themselves. But then in the last couple of years, as AI has kind of re-emerged or kind of been reinvented as neural networks and machine learning, I began to get sort of concerned because the technology is so inscrutable and so hard for regular people to understand that it felt as if it was simply the latest in a succession of technologies that we were powerless to have any impact with, and that it would simply be another tool that the big tech companies use to further optimize the way in which we consume and spend and socialize. And these are things that are destroying not just our democracies, but also our planet. And so I wanted to kind of re-engage with AI to see if there were new ways that we could develop intuitions for what the technology is without having to become technically proficient. And so what I began with was, in contrast to the kind of big AI of Google and Facebook and everybody else, I wanted to make AI as small as possible to see what that would reveal from myself. And in the process, I think I began generating images that I think help people approach the technology from an aesthetic perspective rather than from an intellectual perspective. So if you go back one slide or one more before that, some of the first stuff I started doing in this latest kind of round of work was exploring how the technology understands nature. And so these were images that were taken of flowers on our farm, and I found the kind of interesting echoes of some of the early Hudson River School painting. But I was so interested in the notion of bias, and that, you know, these images contain lots of bias from the technology that we use to photograph them, as well as the way in which I choose which photos to train the machine, that I went to the next series, which was what I'm calling tabula rasa. If you could go to the next slide. And so these, I was training the machine simply on solid colors. And I wanted to see, what does the machine see when it sees something that's pure content, pure abstraction. And so you begin to reveal a kind of materiality of how the machine thinks and how it learns. And you see also a kind of, I think, irrationality. We think that AI is such a smart thing, and it's really, I find, surprisingly at the mercy of what we feed into it. And so these images sort of explore the tension that exists within the kind of organic mind of the machine. And then the last image is, as I've been further manipulating these with my own code, trying to reveal things that might not be visible apparently to the eye of what the machine outputs. So like the images you see here are sort of pure machine output. If you go to the next image after this, this is a kind of manipulation that reveals patterns that we might not have seen otherwise. So that's a kind of summary of the work and the pictures that you see.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I'm just curious. What's the end point of these images? Are they files, or are they then printed onto a substrate, or do they exist as real objects, or are they?
Yes. So I mean, you know, I've done some work in the kind of NFT space, but I'm not especially. I mean, I think that's an interesting space that enables new types of collectors to come into the world. But these primarily exist as prints. And so they're prints either on photographic paper or on aluminum or on paper. And
do you do the printing yourself, or is it?
I find the printing so frustrating because you look at these images on the screen and they're backlit and they're full of energy, and you put them onto paper and it's like they get flat. And so I feel like I've spent endless amounts of time experimenting with different types of materials to print on. And, I think at the moment, I really am enjoying the printing on aluminum, except some of these images are of such high resolution that they just dissolve. They can't print properly. And then there's been another kind of like ultra HD printing on photographic film, which seems to capture them better. And as a side note, Banz and Bowinkel and I are also part of a group called Dark Taxa, which is looking at it's sort of post photography, proto, whatever the next thing might be. And I think as these are kind of photographic works, but not photographic works, and so it opens up that dialogue of what does it even mean for something to be an image or a photograph. I mean, for Chris, how would you talk about how you make your work tangible?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, it's always had a tangible endpoint, unless it's like a moving image, like an MOV, and that's, I would say, a huge part of what the challenge for me is like how do you make something that's innately digital and then bring it into the real world, And I've done I've printed on aluminum, and at the moment, like what the images that you guys saw were all made on linen. But yeah, that's the challenge, is like how do you take something that is innately digital and then turn it into something that has substance and materiality and like lives in our world? And I find that, like endlessly like a really fun challenge and a frustrating challenge, and hopefully an interesting driver for doing things,
Yeah. And I'll let Marie take control back, but I'm also doing a collaboration with a textile artist right now where she is taking the images and then kind of interpreting them as weavings. And it's really fun to sort of watch this translation from a machine learning something to then somebody else interpreting the work that I'm producing.
And some of those, like, is she using like a loom, or she's doing it by hand?
It's more by hand at the moment, like sort of almost like an embroidery kind of process.
Okay. Because some of the early looms really use like digital, I forget what the name of the loom is, but
jacquard.
Jacquard. Yeah, exactly.
That's like the early days of computer programming were modeled on the kind of cards, the punch cards that were used to. Yes.
We're actually having a carpet produced on one of these machines right now. It's an augmented carpet. It's funny that you come up with the topic. Cool. But it's one of the last guys, I think, here in Germany, and he still has these machines from, they're super old, and they work with these cards. It's crazy to watch them work. Actually, it's That's great.
Yeah, heavy industrial machines.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll use this moment to go back to Chris McManus, who's a researcher in neuroaesthetic, as I said in the introduction. So maybe it's a great opportunity to know more about his research and move back to the topic of abstraction. Chris.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed. Okay, I'm the odd guy out here, that's obvious. Let me try and give you some sense of what I do. The first thing I want to say is that I'm a scientist, I'm a psychologist, I'm trying to understand art. And art's a big, complicated field. And artworks themselves are complicated. And that's a problem because they're not very easy to do experiments on. So, you know, if you look at Mondrian's self-portrait on the right-hand side there, trying to manipulate that, change it, and so on to work out what's happening in it is incredibly hard. And what we're trying to do is get things which are simple enough to analyze, and to manipulate, but what we get out at the end is not too simplistic. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want to keep the art, and the tasks that artists do, but we want to make it simple enough for us to work out something about what's going on. So if we look at the next picture, this is about in the 1980s, and I'll say instantly that that's been distorted for those of you who know the works of Mondrian. It's much more stretched horizontally than the real thing. But what we realized was that the classic abstract works of the late works of Mondrian are ideal for doing experiments on. And in fact, neither of these is a real Mondrian. They've both been synthesized in a computer. In fact, they're quite interesting because they're nicer than real Mondrians. People always say that if you go to the galleries, they're always a bit dirty and grubby, whereas these are absolutely pure in some sense. But what we've done here is we've taken one of them and we've moved all the lines around a bit. Nothing else. Everything else is the same. And we started out doing very simple experiments, saying to people, here's two Mondrians. One of them would be worth, you know, $10–50 million in auction. The other's a worthless forgery. Which do you think is which? And it's one of those tasks that people find surprisingly easy and fun. And I'm sure at the moment, if they weren't distorted, since neither of them's real at the moment, you start to ask yourself, well, which is the real one? And if I do a lecture on this, I ask people to put their hands up and I say, look at the one on the left. Do you think that's the real one? And hands go up. Look at the one on the right. Do you think that's the real one? And I'm not going to ask you guys. But if we move on to the next slide, then we'll see that the one on the left is the one that Mondrian would have painted if he'd had a rectangular canvas, in this case. And the other one is the forgery. The interesting bit is that, sorry, just keep on that one for a moment. The interesting bit here is that people can do this. By people, I mean ordinary undergraduates. Nobody special, just ordinary undergraduates. Statistically, they're better than chance on a great run of pictures like this, all Mondrians. So he must be doing something. This helps us to get at what we mean by composition. Okay, so Mondrian was good for us. Now let's move on to the next slide. The trouble with Mondrian and painting in general is that people find it very difficult. They can't do it themselves. They find it very threatening if you talk about Mondrian because they think they're meant to see something which is wonderful and they've, you know, it's a measure of their culture and sophistication and so on. And we rapidly realized that the most interesting thing to look at in the modern world is photography. Everybody takes photographs. And then we realized, of course, that the key task in photography is cropping. And cropping comes in two forms. You can do cropping in the post-production sense of it. You have a picture and you crop out something for a purpose. But also when you hold your camera up to the world, either a digital camera with a little picture or an old-fashioned camera, then what you're doing is moving around and cropping the visual world that you see. You're making choices about what you think looks better or worse and how you want to do it. So we decided to look at this with photography. And our undergraduates like that. So this is a photograph. No, just go back to that one previously. This is a photograph we've used quite a lot. Any of you know London may know Tate Modern. This is not a very typical view of the outside of Tate Modern, but it's a wonderful photograph and it's one we've used a lot. And what we do in our experiments is that comes up on a screen and then people have a window. If we move to the next screen, which is the next picture, which is half, and this doesn't look right, these overlays haven't worked. this is a half the width and a half the height, and it can move around. So if you go on to the next one, for instance, it could be in a slightly different position. And what we ask people to do is simply to use the mouse or the cursor to move around in that picture. And eventually, when they think they've got a good crop, they click on the mouse and we move on to the next picture. It's a nice experiment. People find it fun. And these are sort of results we find. This is our very first experiment. There were 41 non-expert subjects, mostly undergraduates doing all sorts of stuff. Every red dot there is the center of where a person placed it. So notice, first of all, they differ from one another. Secondly, the red box shows the average of where they all put it. And it's quite an interesting photograph in some ways. It's not bad. Nobody sticks the man right over in the corner or something up the top. And so they're making decisions and choices, and they're actively involved in it. So we started to use this quite a lot. Let me just show you a couple of variants on it. Let's look at the next image. This is interesting because it's rather like David Young's picture earlier, actually. It looked like one of the black and white abstract images you show when the picture is, the computer's just doing what it wants to do. Now, this isn't the computer just doing what it wants to do, but it is quite abstract. It's been reduced down to black and white. Ignore the box, by the way. That's just an artifact. I couldn't find it without. But what we find is that people look at this and they try and think what it is. More interestingly, they will crop it. We can give them the same box as I showed you before. They'll move it around and they'll be fairly consistent with one another about where they think it should be cropped. Now, what are they doing? Now, the reason we've chosen this photograph will be seen in a moment because it's actually derived from a real photograph. If you move to the next slide, it's actually heavily computer manipulated to come from that. And the interesting thing is, if you now go back to the previous slide, now you can see where it comes from. And you'll never see it again in the same way. You saw it as an innocent eye. Now, if we move back to the photograph, we can see it differently. And what we find is people crop it in a different way. And yet the intensities of black, white, the areas of light and shade, the shapes of them are all the same. So knowing the image as an image changes what we do. Did one more manipulation on this. We go to the next slide. Now, color dominates this image. And in fact, they crop it in a different place. Normally, the beak, the casque of this macaw is heavily part of the image. Put the color on and they move it across so they get much more of the color in. So we can begin to explore how things change. Let's do the last image I've got from this series, and they're just to give you ideas about the sort of thing we do. This is a much used photograph for all sorts of reasons. It's those of you from New York will probably recognize it. It's from outside Columbia. It's not a very interesting image. It's grabbed off the internet from somewhere. But we ask people to crop it. And when we do that, if we have the next slide, this shows how non-experts, these are our undergraduates, will crop this image. And you can see there's a lot of red dots. They do it in different places. But the next thing we did was to go to the Royal College of Art in London. It has a master's course in photography. Typical students are in their late 20s, early 30s. They've been working in photography as professionals for 6, 8, 10 years, and we asked them to do the same task. And that was interesting because amongst other things, they say, this is a great experiment. This is what I do the whole time. So let's see what they did. And the answer is, in the next slide, they cropped it differently. Now let's put that slide, if you move on one more, you'll see the expert crop alongside the non-expert crop. And it's clear that the experts have got rid of all that boring stuff in the sky, the tops of the building. It's not doing anything. And they're much more concentrating on the people. We then did an experiment again, but we put headset on them and said, talk aloud while you're doing this. What are you up to? And the non-experts just said, oh, she looks very pretty. I put her in or something. It's an interesting place. The experts all said, well, I'm trying to tell a narrative here. Because there's that guy bending down on her left. He's picking something up. So there's actually 4 people in this picture. There's the girl, there's a guy bending down delivering things, and there's the 2 people walking along. What's the story between them? And so they told a narrative. And I think that's what happens the whole time with any cropping. Okay, the essence of what I'm saying is that all art, I suspect, involves a myriad of choices. Cropping is just one of them. You make them the whole time. And what we want to do is find situations where we can begin to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. But for that, we need variation and change. Okay, I'll finish there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. So maybe a good way to introduce the topic of abstraction, because that was the main subject of the exhibition, which we had to build for the research project of Professor Patrick Haggard and Dr. Mariana Babo-Rubello. The first question would be maybe back to Chris, actually. Why do you think, well, could you explain us why abstraction is essential to research in neuroaesthetics?
I think the key thing about abstraction in studying art is if you look at real images, people get distracted by the content and they ignore everything else that actually artists worry about. So, for instance, Flickr has these things where people rate photographs. And when you look at the analysis, it's quite clear. Basically, you get high ratings if you have pictures of cats or if there's a lot of blue in the sky. There's not much there about the nature of photography, I'm afraid. So by using abstraction, we can force people to concentrate on things which are not content. The photography does that to some extent because everything is staying in the picture, but you're choosing the content within that particular set of meanings and so on. So I think abstraction in any form is useful, and Mondrian showed that to us perfectly.
Great, thank you for that. So maybe I'd like to know how, as artists, you relate to the topic of abstraction, if it's something you delve when working on your projects, or if it's like a new framework to kind of look into your work. And I'll start with David. Not David.
Thank you. So I think it's a new framework. I mean, it's always been there. But I thought, you know, when I saw that my work was included in this exhibition, I was really happy to have a new framework to have my work put into, because it helps me sort of understand or approach it in a new way, as well as giving me a new direction. I think, you know, just as when I was part or joined the Dark Taxa group, the proto-post photography group, that also helped me begin to see my work in a kind of photographic context, which also has a huge history. And, you know, probably I began by situating my work in a kind of new media or generative art context. And, you know, sometimes that feels like it can be a little bit of a ghetto from the rest of the art world. And so, although you could also say photography, the art world doesn't know what to do with that either. But I think being able to put your work into multiple contexts allows me to look at my work in much more rich ways, and gives me more paths going forward to think about what I want to do.
Thank you. Sara, would you have a point of view to share on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think of like abstraction and representation as these like very like human-centric constructs, because essentially everything is information and energy and everything is a material. But I think that like when we see something that is abstract versus something that has representation, it's just like, it's like a perceptual shift that we have. So like, if you have like a figurative painting, you're going to sort of understand what it is you're seeing, and then you're going to start decoding meaning from it, and you're going to recognize these forms. And that's like something that as humans we feel very comfortable with. Like our perception, like, and the way that we see is basically like how we are surviving in the world. And like abstraction feels more like distant, and it's way harder for us to like decode that. So we kind of like are put in this like position of just like accepting it, and then perhaps like we will find like an emotional resonance with it or something that's like more guttural instead of like the more like logic brain. So for me, I kind of like to dissolve that like line between abstraction and representation, where something presents itself that you're kind of uncertain, and it just kind of makes you like surrender to the experience of it. That's kind of like what I'm interested in for my work, and kind of how I see abstraction. I don't think of like I don't make abstract work. I think abstraction has been adopted by all artists as just like part of their vocabulary. I can't even think of like one artist who'd be like, oh yeah, I make like abstract work. It's just kind of like, yeah, we've just kind of adopted it as like the same way like we adopt a color or something. Like we're kind of beyond this, like in this like post-abstraction kind of realm, I guess I would say.
Okay, cool. Interesting. Chris or Julia Friedman, would you like to add something?
Yeah, maybe what was, I mean, there are different aspects which are interesting, or which interested us in our work, but concerning the abstraction, I think in the beginning we somehow liked the aesthetics of the computer, the rendering, and the rendering is it's very, very complex and very, very hyper-realistic immediately when you build a scene. The programs are made to have a very, very big realism in your images, and we found it very interesting to give the abstract forms and this hyperrealism to create a world like our physical world, but something you have maybe never seen in our real world. And for example, the fluids with our body paintings, like Chris said, we wanted to show something what does time mean when you render a picture. You can scroll in a timeline. You can have different parallel time lines and combine them in one picture, which you couldn't do in film or in painting, and or use the same shape and give them different materials and put them together. So I think also you can play with this. In our case, what the computer can do and how the computer works, and play with it.
Can I add a question to that, or a thought? Because it sounds like you're almost saying that something can be hyper-realistic, but because it's hyper-realistic to something that doesn't actually exist in our world, it can still be, that makes it abstract. So
yes, because what you see, it doesn't exist. Yes, but it simulates it. If you watch that image, it looks like it has to be there somewhere. But it's not.
It's like the rays hitting your eye trigger your brain to think this is real, even though at the same time, it's not. It's
a trompe-l'oeil, but made in an aesthetic of photography, which still has a little. It's still photography. Still triggers us to first believe that it's real, even though also photography doesn't of course, depict the reality, but it's still very.
But still more than a rendering, you should say.
More, yeah, but rendering also comes very close, but more than a painting. A painting, you immediately see that's a painting, and it's not a photography, so.
Yeah, it's good that you bring up this diversity of media rendering and the notion of like time and textures and rendering, because when we built the exhibition, we had to use still images for the research, but I feel like actually like moving image and like other tools like virtual reality and different like notions of body and performance and placing the human within your work is actually an important aspect of dealing with your works, like in substance or body painting. And yeah, so yep. But perhaps like I'd like to ask you, how do you make aesthetic choices in your work, and yes, what are like the trigger points? Chris McManus was talking about these moments where you crop a picture, where you manipulate an image, where you bring elements together, and maybe we can go a bit more into like how you process these different elements in your work and at what stage these aesthetic components become important. Chris, would you like to start? Chris Dorland?
Sure. I think I just wanted to say one thing though about abstraction, because I've been kind of, thinking about this talk. Yeah. And, I was really happy to be in the show, and I've always thought of what I do as abstraction, but I definitely work with representational imagery. So I think that made me happy to be in the show, precisely because I felt like there was an understanding of the work as abstraction despite its representational components. And just thinking kind of also to what you guys were talking about in terms of making something abstract hyper real, and I really feel like we live in a completely hyper real world that is so simulated, so detailed and representational, and yet simultaneously it's more abstract than ever, and there's so many layers, there's so many things happening that even you look at the, I mean, people can't even agree over, reality anymore. And I think in that sense, I mean, I feel that there's a real tension between, hyper representation and then complete abstraction to the point of almost incomprehension. And I think it sounds sort of like, to varying degrees, we're all like working at that intersection. So that's how I would answer that. To quickly answer the question about aesthetic decisions, I feel like I try to make, I know that I do make aesthetic decisions, but I actually think by employing the machine, by letting chance elements into the work, I have an incredibly large tolerance for decision making. And I know that I do make decisions, and there's, I'm sure, micro decisions being made all the time. But as much as I possibly can to try to let things happen that are out of my control and kind of try to let that be is definitely something that drives my studio practice. And therefore the cropping, if we think of cropping as a decision-making tool, I try to have a big viewfinder, that can kind of take in as much as possible.
Sara, would you have like inputs to give about your process and how you use elements like cropping or composition?
So, I mean, I'll refer to these paintings specifically since I have so many different types of processes in my work. But I think, like working in 3D, we are in a post-photographic space where rendering is essentially like a computer photograph, and we're you know, like I work in Maya, so I have a camera and I can build something in 3D, compose it through a viewfinder, but then I can, you know, take the camera, rotate it around, put it in different perspective modes, spherical, parallel projection, and so forth, that gives like different senses of scale, depth, and so forth. So yeah, like what Chris was saying, like I too really love having an element of chance. Like I don't want to be so laborious and just craft everything. So like I'll craft a bit and then rotate around the object and so forth. And then I'll be like, oh yeah, like that makes sense, that works, that's it. So yeah, or even, you know, that can be like once I like render something in a 3D program and bring it into Photoshop, I might also just like rotate it 180. And then to me, it's like, then it can be done. And then also there's this like element of surprise and discovery that I think is really important. And I think that these technologies lend themselves to like being able to do that a lot faster. Like if I was just making a painting on an easel, like I really don't have that possibility. So it just kind of like allows you to have these sort of like multi-dimensional perspectives on what you're working. And for me, that's like a lot of fun.
Great. I think talking about aesthetical choices, we could talk about the relationship that you build with machines and algorithms. And Patrick Haggard has notably asked a question which I think would be great for you, David, to address. I would be interested to hear about using algorithms to create abstract work. What can we learn from it, and with what aesthetic results?
Right. So, sorry, I dropped off for a second. My internet died, but I'm back. I think you know, even using the word algorithms is there's a bit of a weight to what that means. That, you know, if you think, if I think of what I would say is traditional generative art, that would be artists encoding rules in algorithms, whether it's in code or whether it's on a piece of paper. And so those rules are like, you know, if this, then this. The rules can get quite complex, but the artist is, and the rules can also include randomness, but the artist is the one that is setting up the framework and setting the kind of the rules by which the machine creates. And again, I'm saying algorithm, I'm saying machines because that's my practice, but there's plenty of ways in which artists also use algorithms to create analog work too. I think personally what is really interesting about AI and machine learning is that the artist, or, you know, the person using these tools is not setting up frameworks and they're not setting up rules. What they're doing is they're showing the machine, in this case, you know, I'm talking about with GANs, they're showing the machine a set of images or other kind of source material, and the machine then uses its kind of framework to develop its own understanding of what that material is. And what makes it so different is that we can't open up the neural network to understand what rules the machine has learned. Instead, it has a much more kind of organic understanding of things. And so we can get the machine to create things, which is a kind of example or manifestation of its knowledge, but it's not an articulation of its knowledge. So, I mean, for me, that's more a kind of technical difference of what traditional generative art is versus more modern AI and machine learning art is. So sorry, ask me again what the question was, and maybe I can wrap that up somehow.
Yeah, so
I see the question here. It's like, what can we learn from it, and with what aesthetic results? So, you know, what we learn from it is, you know, we all, I mean, I think in particular with machine learning, we are learning to develop new intuitions for what the machine is doing. We don't have to be technical experts to use this technology, but by feeding it and training it with different things, we begin to kind of develop a new understanding for ourselves. As to the aesthetic results, well, that's, you know, that entirely depends on the person or the artist that's using these tools. And, you know, I would like to think that, you know, speaking for me personally, but I think I would say this for the other artists on this panel, that, you know, I really look for work which is beautiful. And there was at some point somebody told me that as an artist, I'm not allowed to say that my work is beautiful. We have to have other people say that about our work. But, you know, that's my goal, because I think if work is beautiful, it's going to engage people and sort of pull them in and make them want to understand it more deeply.
I'm so pleased to hear that word, I must say, because it's the one that all the people who view the work of artists use the whole time to describe what they like and don't like. It's not one that artists use very much, it must be said. They're quite allergic to it in general. But it is actually what drives so much of what's going on. And I think Sarah at one point said, when you think that's nice, what is that nice is the question I'm after. Why is that nice and that's not? And there's so many, you know, there's many types of niceness, but there's many types of not niceness as well in the world. How do we choose between them?
I thought quite some times now, if I may say something, of Cézanne, who said that, I'm sure you're familiar with that sentence. He said that an image has to work like, it has to be something like this. I think what he meant was that he tried to achieve a structure of the image where all parts of the image are interwoven in a way that the spectator cannot get out of it, in a way. I think when you were showing these experts cropping the image, I think what they were better at was to find a framework for what the image contains.
Yes.
Within which the spectator constantly roamed around.
Yes.
Like if you were in a prison without knowing it, in a way. And so keeping you in this picture and keeping you interact with what you see. I think that's the goal of every artist, to create this experience where you keep it's like a trap, but a very beautiful trap.
Right. Yeah. It was Bergin, wasn't it, who in a book on photography said that the challenge of photography is that you have a frame around the outside and you have to keep the attention of the viewer locked within it, because the moment they leave that frame, they're looking at something else and they may well not come back. And I think that's what that expert crop did. It kept your eyes going round and round and inside. It's a bit like the theory that the whole of film is actually an exercise in maintaining attention. Because the moment the viewer stops attending to the film, then they start eating their popcorn and you've lost them. So you've got to keep their attention the whole time. And of course, all these works of art are within frames, you know, to a large extent. Most of you seem to be doing rectangular things, roughly speaking. But maintaining attention is actually a key part. And that's what Cézanne's saying. There's always somewhere to go and something keeps interesting you and you keep moving around it. You never tire of it, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot about the balance of the parts of a picture. Yeah. I think you cannot just put something in the middle and say that's it. And I think the moment that you really start to stare at something for too long, you get bored and then you leave because you think you got the point, basically. I think that's okay. I got it. I can leave now. But I think
on the screen above me, I've got your body paint picture. And it's interesting because, of course, whatever you do, you barely go to the edges. You don't want people to leave the picture. It's like endless snakes and ladders where you keep going back in.
We have
noticed, I suspect,
that do exactly that. It's interesting because an artist friend of ours, we showed that was in a very early stage, and we showed the like a precursor of the body paintings to him, and he said, you never really crop things. You have everything you can see is within the frame. Why do you do that? A photographer would never do that. You need to have something go outside the frame. So one would ask himself, where is it going? So that he would get attracted by something that you cannot see in the picture, but you know it's there. So it's funny that you mentioned that.
Yeah. To go back to Mondrian, do those lines go on forever, or do they just stop? Are there black and white black lines going on into infinity? Who knows? Sorry.
I'm sure they go to infinity.
I actually think this idea
would be very boring.
But I think this idea that if a line goes off the edge of the frame, that actually could lead then to the next piece of art on the wall next to it. So you have to be careful who you're connecting with.
It's fine as long as the next piece is a work by you. I guess it's not if it's somebody else. Yeah.
Cool. To go back on the notion of beauty and aesthetics, I know, David, you said it was important to have a work that is beautiful. I'd love to know how, the other artists relate to this notion of beauty in their work, or do you like to kind of work on emotions or on certain values when building an abstract work, or do you rather focus on subject matter as a framework?
I'll answer. I definitely, it's funny that David mentioned thinking about beauty. I for sure think about beauty, but I think I also really think about ugliness and not beautiful things. And I think the beauty in art is really can change, we're even thinking about early kind of art that was made with AI. In the beginning, I thought it was really ugly, like the kind of imagery that Banz created. And now I've come to find them very appealing, and I sort of really like the aesthetic decisions that happen when GANs are being generated, some of the pointiness. And I was curious, so I think about beauty, but I don't care what's beautiful. I really think anything can be beautiful. And I think that's the history, especially of modern art, is, ugly things becoming beautiful, and then sort of, like an abstract expressionist painting is so beautiful, but when it was first made, I don't think people thought it was beautiful. It was shocking. It was, maybe upsetting even. And I was curious to ask you, Chris, how much does beauty and the idea of beauty play into your research? Is that something that you're engaged in, or is that irrelevant to the nature of your research?
I think it's central to it, because when you show people anything, you have to ask them something. You can't just say, what do you think of this? You get nothing back. So, and normally we say, how beautiful is it? Or how much do you like it? How pleasant is it? How interesting is it? We ask them a lot of questions. But actually, when you keep doing that, beauty is the thing they keep coming back to. And when you say, why do you prefer this one to this one? Well, it's more beautiful, and it's the end of the road as a discussion. Interestingly, for the last few years, I've had a very good PhD student, young Jin He. He's now qualified, and he's been working not just on beauty but on the sublime. And the sublime is a very different thing to beauty, and it took us a long while to prove they were separate components. But the sublime is much more to do with awe and power and threat. The beauty is much more to do with prettiness and pleasantness and that sort of stuff. But combine the two together and you get magnificence and awe and that sort of a mountain range. That's sublime in every sense, isn't it? And so those two things are separate. And interestingly, when we get people classifying, ugliness comes out as ugliness is neither beauty nor the sublime. It's neither.
So what is it?
It's just ugliness. We wouldn't want it on our living room wall, I guess, is the sort of description. But I think you're right. People can learn to like it. Go back to the 70s and 80s and think about minimalist music. People thought Philip Glass and Steve Reich and so on were terrible. Now they're wonderful, and we've learned to love them. And I think that's true with all of the arts. If an artist is doing a good job, it's us who's failing to some extent, and we learn how to see and hear what they're doing, and that can take a long while. You've been doing it longer than we have, so it takes us longer to see what you're up to.
Right, and that's kind of the nature of their contribution. You know, it's sort of putting something into the world that forces people to have to come around to making sense of it, and then at that point it's been adopted, and you need a new group of artists to sort of push something along or introduce something into the kind of lexicon.
But part of the narrative, you see, I always think, you know, when you look at anything which you haven't seen before, it's so much nicer if you're going around a gallery with somebody else and you talk about all the things. And what one's searching for very often is a narrative. So why did the artist do that? What are they trying to tell us? And you sort of tell us, but really it's your works that have to speak for them. And so we want to find out more about that. And I think, you know, you help us, but in the end we have to find it. But the fact you've spent a long while doing it means that we trust you to be doing something sensible, I guess.
Can I again, sorry, I dropped off, and I know that our time is probably running out, but I think I think this our idea of explaining our work or people understanding our work, you know, I think the Sublime is a super fascinating context, because I think especially with AI and the scale at which the machine can understand something and the range in which it can produce is interesting. But I also think, that, you know, there is this notion at the same time of the aesthetic experience, and this is an experience that does not need to be expressed in words. It's something that we feel when we see a work of art, and that can be a huge motivator in not just our appreciation of the work, but I think also of cultural change, because it excites the imagination and it gets people to start thinking about the world in a way that is, again, non-verbal. And it's like, how do we feel we want the world to be?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, I mean, the Greek term for aesthetics is perception, and it doesn't judge. It doesn't judge it by itself. It's more about maybe our perception also changes all the time. I think Botticelli is beautiful, no question. But if someone would paint a painting like Botticelli today, it so much doesn't fit our contemporary aesthetics and soul, let us say soul and everything and the feelings. So it wouldn't be nice. It wouldn't be beautiful, such a painting in the style of Botticelli right now. So and there are some times when things maybe are cruel or very distorted, and maybe a distorted image would refer more to these feelings and then some beautiful, very glamorous, I don't know, sculpture.
Yes.
Golden sculpture or something. And it would feel just ugly and superficial. I don't know.
Or insulting.
So it's something which changes all the time.
And yet there are certain things that survive, I suspect.
And also survive. And there's something classical.
And that's what you're all after, ultimately.
But always in the context of a certain time. I think the pyramids in Egyptian, if somebody would build it now in, I don't know, in some rich country, it
Las Vegas,
a little bit.
We're now back to kitsch, of course, which we haven't.
Yes, well, thank you for all these comments. I think we'll be inviting Mariana Babo-Rebello and Patrick Haggett to join us for the conclusion. They are the researchers who built this research for UCL. Hello, Patrick. Hello, Mariana.
Hi. Let me just say it's a great pleasure to see you all. So we've been working on this adventure with MoCDA for a couple of months now. And it was great to have your work on the exhibition and the project. So it's great to see you. It was great to listen to your really interesting discussion. And we're looking forward to the next panels this week.
So I'd just like to add my thanks. I think we've seen some
fantastic artworks which MoCDA have helped us to select and to position in the virtual gallery, which you've probably had a chance to see. And we've been able to use the arrangement of the artworks in the virtual gallery to test some quite, to us, interesting hypotheses about how our aesthetic experiences occur in a context. So when we look at each one of your artworks, we have a great aesthetic experience. But one thing which interests me is that a gallery, for example, is a place where we have many aesthetic experiences, and they somehow relate to one another. And we couldn't find any research on that topic, even from Chris. So we decided to do some research on it. And Mariana's given us some fantastic leadership to it, and you've given some fantastic artworks, and we hope to have more discussions about it in the panels the rest of this week. And we hope in the long run there's going to be some publications in the sort of aesthetics literature describing the work. So it's been a really great journey for us.
Yeah, and I think we also found really interesting to have discussions that somehow were similar to this one, where we contrast our views as scientists with MoCDA, so Marie's and Serena's views, and it generated really interesting discussions, and that's why we thought it would be interesting to organize these panels. So I can just quickly say that, so tomorrow I'll be chairing a panel where we'll discuss rather the environment, so the museum and what it means to have a virtual museum rather than a real museum. And we'll have artists, people from the tech world, architects, and also another person of cognitive science to discuss this topic. And on Thursday, I'll have another panel where we'll try to see what can cognitive science bring to museums. So what can we help? How can we help? What can we understand with our tools? And I'd like to add vice versa. What can we learn as scientists from what artists do? And Patrick, you have a panel on Wednesday.
Yeah, so I'll be moderating a panel which is called The Future of the Museum in the Digital Age. It's dealing with art galleries as well as museums, and it's dealing very much with how the digital environment can work at the level of the collection of the ensemble of multiple artworks. And we're going to have curators, artists, audience people, and a really diverse set of inputs. You're all welcome.
Sounds good.
Well, great. Well, we look forward to this. Serena, would you like to add the last word?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Marie, for moderating this panel, and thank you to all the speakers that have joined, Mariana and Patrick as well. So thank you so much for all the content that has been shared. I hope it's been of interest to all the people watching. And I wish to invite everybody to go and see the show, which is going to be open until the 9th of May on MoCDA. So you can visit this online, and also the research has been made available. So you can also take the experiment and see how this feels like, and see what you can remember going through the show. Also want to add that a poster has been made available as an NFT, as a non-fungible token to collect. This is a limited edition of 100, and all the revenue generated from this, it will go to support all the participating artists. So you can find all these information on the MoCDA website. But once again, thank you so much for attending this panel conversation, and we hope to see you again in the upcoming talks in the following days. Thank you again, Marie, for moderating, and thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice meeting all of you.
Bye. Thank you so much for joining.